Hello. Today we're going to be talking about the Avaya System Manager directory synchronization process and link. To basically start with, what exactly is directory sync? Well, the Avaya System Manager can be linked to a LDAP server, or more specifically a Active Directory server, and what that will enable is, as users are added into your Active Directory server, they can be automatically pulled across into System Manager, and at that particular point, System Manager can then manage the user like it would with any user that has been added directly to the System Manager through its normal user creation processes. I do want to quickly point out that throughout this video, we will be talking about Active Directory as a specific example, but System Manager is able to be connected to a number of different LDAP servers. So even though I may specifically refer to Active Directory, any LDAP server that's compatible with System Manager can be slotted in here. To begin with, we're going to first have to set up something called a data source. And we're going to get to the creation of a data source by going up into the menu bar for System Manager, going to Users, and then clicking on Directory Synchronization, and then clicking on the New button under the Data Sources tab. Once that page opens up, you will see a form that looks basically identical to our example here. And this particular set of parameters is going to tell the System Manager all of the various details that it needs in order to be able to connect to the LDAP server. Looking down through the various fields, most of them I think are fairly self-explanatory, particularly things like the data source name. We obviously have to name each individual data source that we add. The host, the principal, the password, and the port are just the basic networking details that are going to be needed. The host is going to be either the FQDN or the IP address of your Active Directory server. Principal and password are basically just your credentials to access the LDAP server. And the port is just that. It's the port that System Manager is going to try and connect to the LDAP server on. I will note here, specifically with regards to the port, that there are two default selections here. The first is the unencrypted port, which is what we have as our example. 389 is the unencrypted LDAP port. If you wanted to use secure LDAP or encrypted LDAP, you would change the port to 636. So once again, those particular fields I think are fairly straightforward in terms of how they would be used and what you need to enter there. I will also, just as a quick note as well, mention that the principal and the password, this is going to be an administrator for the LDAP server. A regular user won't work. And in a lot of cases, you're going to want not just a simple administrator for the LDAP server, but you're going to want a domain admin simply to give you the level of permission that will be required to pull those users across. The last three specific fields here, so base distinguished name, LDAP user schema, and search filter, those are going to be the particular parameters System Manager is going to use to actually look for or search for a user. So I'll start with the two easier objects or fields to understand, and that is the search filter and the LDAP user schema. So the user schema is simply an attribute within the LDAP server that is shared amongst all of the various users within the Active Directory's hierarchy. Every single user should have this particular parameter set, and it should be the same for every user within the hierarchy. In our case here, we have inet.org_person, and in pretty much all cases, inet.org_person is going to be the expected value for your user schema. There is the possibility that this can be changed to some other attribute, but most of the time you're going to expect to see inet_org_person as your user schema. All of your users will be set up or will have the attribute of inet_org_person set up inside of their object within the Active Directory server. Search filter, again, this is simply going to be what System Manager is going to be looking for. So what users are we looking to actually pull across? Remember, the user schema tells us what a user object is inside of Active Directory. The search filter basically tells us who, or rather what users are we going to be pulling across or are we going to be interested in. The search filter you see here, CN equals star or asterisk, this is just simply a wildcard search, meaning that we're going to be looking for all users within the Active Directory hierarchy. Now, it's not quite accurate to say that we're going to be looking for every user within the hierarchy. And the reason for that is the last field we're going to talk about here, the base distinguished name. What this is it is a structure that will be used to describe the path or the location within the LDAP server hierarchy as to where all of your different users are actually located at. So this base distinguished name, you can basically think about it in a similar sort of fashion to, say, a full path in a Linux environment where you have perhaps a particular directory within Linux that you want to get to. You really need to know the path or the full path between the root down to where that directory is located. This base distinguished name is that same kind of idea, except rather than talking about a directory or a folder, we're talking about the location where all of your users are going to be stored at. And once again, this base distinguished name tells us the full path to where the users are located at. The LDAP user schema tells us within that location, within that path, what are users. And then the final field, the search filter, tells us which users we're going to be pulling across from that particular location. The remaining three parameters on this, or in this configuration, use SSL, allow deletions, and allow null values, are basically the refinement for how the sync will operate, how it will behave. Are we going to use SSL or encryption? Are we going to allow System Manager to delete users on the Active Directory server, the LDAP server? And are we going to allow users who have particular values set to empty or null, are they going to be allowed to come across? Generally speaking, you will want at least SSL and allow null values to be set up. Allow deletions can get a little bit weird depending on what the overall expected behavior is. Sometimes we just simply want to remove a user from the System Manager. If that's the case, setting allow deletions to enabled, or putting the check mark in, that could potentially have some knock-on effects where the user is actually removed from the Active Directory or LDAP server. So this allow deletions flag is really important to ensure you know if a user is deleted from System Manager for some reason, they could potentially be removed from your Active Directory server. So whether allow deletions is enabled or not is a design choice, and either option is perfectly viable. It just becomes a question of how you want the deletions within System Manager to work. Do you only want them removed from System Manager, or do you want them removed from System Manager and Active Directory? When it comes to, so we've set up all of our parameters within the data source. The very last step there to complete is to use the test connection button. That is absolutely critical. You will not see these attribute mappings without having tested the connection, and that test needs to be successful. So before you will see the actual attribute parameters or the attribute mappings that we're looking at here, you have to make sure that your connection test between System Manager and the LDAP server is successful. If it is, you'll see these list of attributes, and specifically what you will see when this is initially set up. You'll have your attribute parameters on the left-hand side, and they will have to be manually mapped to the values that you see on the right-hand side. When this is initially deployed and set up, these mappings are absolutely mandatory, and they are also going to have expected values that they will map to. So the 5 options on the left-hand side in the drop-down menus, those are 5 mandatory values within System Manager that need to have an assigned value. The mappings on the right are what the LDAP attributes on the left are being mapped to within System Manager. Without these mappings in place, System Manager will not be able to create users, because each of the values that you see on the left-hand side map to required fields when you create a user within System Manager. So, given name, surname, display name, and UPN and object GUID are all attributes within the LDAP server that map to the specific values you see on the left-hand side, or pardon me, on the right-hand side. Once you've created these mappings, you can commit this, and that will create your data source, and System Manager should now be able to start pulling users across using these parameters that we have set up. That does lead us to the next part, or the next step. Once the data source is defined within System Manager, the very next thing you need to consider is, do you want System Manager to, on a scheduled basis, reach out to the LDAP server and pull across any new users, or do you want to simply run on-demand syncs between System Manager and the LDAP server? Generally speaking, I recommend having at least one scheduled sync that operates, whether it's run every day or once a week. It is important to have some sort of scheduled job that runs, just in case perhaps things get very busy and you aren't able to run that on-demand job as you normally would. Having the regularly scheduled sync to fire is really helpful to ensure that your System Manager and your LDAP or Active Directory server are synced up in terms of what users exist. So the synchronization job can be done manually, there's nothing wrong with that, but having a scheduled job that fires, again, daily or weekly, can really help to cover any situation where maybe new users have been added since the last manual or on-demand sync was executed, and it's just a simple way to kind of catch any users that may have been missed that have been added since the last sync job. Now, we've got our data source defined, we've set up, or we've run our first actual sync job. At that point, you will now have a list of users that exist in System Manager that have been pulled across from the Active Directory or the LDAP server. At this point, you have one additional choice that you have to make, and that is, do you want your users that have been pulled across through this directory synchronization process, do you want those to be manually configured via an administrator going in and assigning communication profiles, whether for Session Manager, for Communication Manager, for messaging? Or do you want the System Manager to automatically provision those users as they have come across? The choice here really comes down to how much administration is going to be required to cover your user base. Sometimes, if you're a smaller enterprise that only adds users every once in a while, maybe it just makes sense to have the administrator manually configure those users. However, if you're constantly adding new users and new users are being synced across from the LDAP server regularly, setting up what's called a user provisioning rule that will automatically create the user profiles that are required. Again, the user provisioning rule can be set up or will be set up to add Session Manager, communication profile, a CM endpoint profile, a messaging profile. And the user provisioning rule will simply eliminate the need for administrators to manually go in and set up and configure shared details. So setting up, rather than having the administrator have to go to 10 new users and all add in the exact same configuration, what session managers they're using, what application sequences are being used, what CM is being used, the user provisioning rule can set up those details automatically and can be triggered based on new users coming into the system manager. So again, once you've got your data source defined, you've run your first sync, whether you're going to manually provision those users or use a UPR to provision the users is, again, going to be a choice that comes down to how much administration is really going to be required. So, with System Manager Directory Synchronization, we're basically talking about two processes. The first is creating a link between System Manager and an LDAP server. And the second part of that process is creating a synchronization that occurs based on the details entered within the data store. So directory synchronization is all about creating a link between an LDAP server and System Manager, and then allowing the System Manager to pull users across through that synchronization link. Once the users are actually inside System Manager, they can be configured and set up the same as any user that was added directly to the System Manager through its web interface, and they can be either provisioned manually or automatically. Thank you everyone for watching the video, and we will see you in the next one.